But yes, I'm Ada Simpson. I'm Head of Quality in Early Years Settings at the Department for Education, and I'm really pleased to be here with you today from cloudy South London, and thank you so much for being here with us. Also, thank you, really to reiterate what Jill has already said, thank you for everything you've done over this past year. And in some ways, I can't believe we've managed to get through a year of this. And in other ways, it feels like so much longer than a year. So I can't imagine what it must be like for those of you working sort of on the front line, keeping settings open and everything you do. So thank you very much. As Jill has said, what we want to do today is to talk about the EYFS reforms, which are coming in from September this year, to give people an update. And we particularly wanted to focus today a bit on reducing paperwork and workload burdens, as that's something that we get questions on. So we thought that that would be helpful for people. Before we get into that, though, if we move to the next slide, I wanted to give a bit of an update on some things relating to COVID. Because we know some of these things will be of interest to people. So we wanted to say on testing, people might have seen updates on this already. If we can just go to the next slide, or maybe I'm just not seeing it. Thank you. Staff in nurseries and childminders can get regular asymptomatic testing, which is the lateral flow tests. That is alongside the existing system with symptomatic testing, which remains there as well. So that's really good and hopefully feels very, very helpful for people. Testing is not mandatory for staff, and staff don't need to provide proof of a test, but we hope that people will find that they want to take up regular testing and that proves to be really useful. The temporary disapplications to the EYFS, which were set up to help people to manage during COVID, remain in place. At this point, they remain in place until August this year. So hopefully that's easing the burden. Obviously, as the slide says there's also an extension to paediatric first aid certificates until the end of March. So we're looking at that closely. I mean, obviously our priority is on having people have the right PFA certification in settings, but if anybody's experiencing real issues around paediatric first aid training, then please let us know about that. I should mention, people might have seen that in February, the government announced £18 million of investment for the early years to help support children to recover from the impacts of COVID. So we hope that really will help. There's also obviously ongoing work on how to support children, how to support the workforce in early years to support children, and so that everybody's wellbeing can be prioritised and supported. Another aspect of the disapplications I should have mentioned before I move on was about the EYFS profile assessment. So that has been changed this year from a mandatory requirement to a best endeavours requirement. So we're hoping that the majority of schools and settings will find that they're still able to do that at the end of reception year point. But if they do, there's going to be no moderation and no need to report the data. So yeah, thanks for that. We can move on to the next slide then, please. Thank you. I wanted to give a bit of an update on the legislative process that will bring the changes to the EYFS into place. People might have seen that we had a consultation period on some further minor changes to the EYFS framework. That took place between the 18th of February and the 18th of March. That was for small changes to section 3, which were largely clarifications. So they were relating to things that have changed since the last EYFS framework was brought in. Sorry, my computer's giving me some messages. Let me try and get rid of those. And things that we often hear from people aren't as clear as they could be. So that's the nature of those small changes. Obviously, that consultation period has closed, so we are now in the process of looking at all of those responses, and then our intention is that we will be in a position to publish the final EYFS framework in the spring on gov.uk, so that everyone will have good time to see that before the reforms come in on a statutory basis from September. You might already have seen some of the information and support materials that we've been sharing to help people to prepare for the reforms. So obviously things like these events today, there have been some webinars previously, and there will be more of those. And some of those will cover content from Ofsted as well, because we've heard how important that is for people. We are sort of staggering some of those materials. We know that people are after different types of materials and support, and that also people have so much on that it's hard to absorb lots of information at once. So we are trying to focus on giving a sort of first wave of materials, probably covering things like communication and language, personal, social and emotional development, maths, and supporting children with SEND. But as I say, there will be more staggered over time. There will be some online support, that's going to be a sort of range of contents that will include practical information, examples of activities that could be taken with children under the new EYFS. It's also going to include some sort of interviews and case studies from people like early adopters of the reforms, to share what they think about the reforms, how they've been managing it, and what has been useful for them. So those materials are currently in user testing, and the initial feedback we've had is very positive. This will then be launched in something called a public beta. You might have seen that sometimes on gov.uk, where you go on the page and it says that, you know, a format is in public beta, and that essentially means that we are still sort of testing material but on a wider scale. So please do give your feedback on material, on content, how useful it is, how clear it is, what more you need, so then we can take that all into account and try to improve things and give people the support they want. And obviously from our perspective, that support will be happening, you know, it's not just a case of between now and September, you know, over the sort of coming year. I mentioned there the early adopters of the reforms, which is about 3,000 schools who are taking part in that this year voluntarily. We surveyed those, I think last month, and we've had really positive feedback from early adopters about how they have been able to reduce workloads, even whilst going through the process of bringing in the changes to the reform, to the EYFS, which, you know, as you can imagine, could feel for many people like a workload burden in itself. So it's been really, really good to hear that actually people feel the impact already of the reforms. So if we move on to the next slide then, in terms of reducing unnecessary paperwork, we know that in the past there has been DfE guidance that has probably contributed to a sort of culture that we see, where there can be a lot of evidence collection, a lot of tracking of children, both pre-reception and throughout the reception year. And our message with the EYFS reforms is that we really want to move away from that. And what we want to have instead is a focus on practitioners and teachers having maximum time to support children and to think about their needs, rather than having to spend a lot of time doing paperwork, tracking and reporting on where children are at. We think that this can make a really powerful change. So we really want to say, you know, the reforms aren't just a new set of ELGs in the profile or changes to the educational programmes. You know, we really want people to think very holistically about their curriculums, and also about how they can avoid tracking. I think we've got a quote from an early adopter who said, "The reforms allow you to spend more time with children and getting to know what they can and cannot do." And that's very much what we'd like to see happening. I mean, of course, you know, assessment is still important, and in the EYFS there will remain the 2-year check and the EYFS profile, and that's very important for helping, you know, staff, parents understand where children are at and what they need. And of course, you know, ongoing assessment as well continues to be important, but it's about doing it in a proportionate way. And I think Julian has some really good advice to share on that a bit later. We are saying from the DfE that there is no requirement to hold lots of paperwork and to gather evidence to back up the assessments that you make on children's progress. So moving on to the next slide, which confirms that we are removing statutory local authority moderation. I'm not seeing it come up on my screen, but it might just be mine. Oh, there we go. Thank you. So EYFS, statutory moderation by local authorities of the EYFSP is being removed. So that's not only the disapplication for this year, that will be the ongoing position that does not need to happen. The pilots that we did on the EYFS reforms with about 24 schools found that this was so dramatic in helping reduce workload, but also really help put the focus back on teachers and practitioners' professional judgment, which is brilliant. Of course, other types of LA support and engagement will remain. They will still have a statutory duty to provide training and support to settings that require it. So LAs have been supporting early adopter settings this year as well. We've run dedicated LA training sessions and provided information directly to local authorities on this. And we will also be updating the handbook that goes alongside the EYFS framework, which will share more information about how assessment can be done well under the new EYFS. We will be trying, as the slide says, to get that published earlier than we would normally in the annual cycle, so that people have more time to look at it. So moving on to the next slide, I've said a bit already about unnecessary tracking. And as I said, the purpose of the EYFS profile is for an assessment at the end of the reception year, usually when the child is 5, so that they can understand where a child's at, what support they need as they transition into year 1, and what information the parents need. It's not intended to be used as a measure for performance of staff. The new development matters has been changed to reflect the approach we want to take, with not having sort of age bands to try and track children against, because we know that people have said that became often a sort of tick list of things, and actually what's more important is to find ways to secure children's learning. In the new development matters, people might have seen it already. There are observation checkpoints which can help you to notice whether a child is at risk of falling behind in their development. Those aren't intended to be used as a checklist of what children can do, but just to provide some support there on noticing what children need. I wanted to sort of end by giving another quote from an early adopter school, which I think was really powerful. They said, "We have rewritten our EYFS curriculum statement using all of the new resources as a start point. Our ethos has strongly moved away this year from banding and tracking. We no longer talk in terms of in-year figures. Instead, we talk about individuals, what areas they are finding more difficult, why, and what we can do to help them." And that's exactly what we want to see.